Good morning, everyone in the US. Good afternoon, myself and Eden. Really good to be here. I always was very impressed that this happened in the US and wish there was a way that I could join. Now I'm here.
And so would it be good to start with a presentation immediately, or should we do a quick introduction?
Maybe we can just share the opening slide and then we can just talk over that. So 1 second.
Lovely.
While I share. Is that visible?
Amazing. Yes, I can see that.
Yeah, ready to start when you are, Eden.
Amazing. So I thought it would just be good for myself and John to introduce ourselves very briefly. My name is Eden. My pronouns are they, them, ze, and she, her. I am a member of the Jewish community in the northwest of England, near Manchester. And for my job, I'm a professional LGBT and student advocate. And I'm here because I would like to cry about my country to people who will be very understanding. You next, John.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm a member of Masorti, which is also called Conservative in the US, a synagogue in London. And I work for a charity during my day job. And yeah, very happy to be here, really. I've been to CBST before for a service when I was at a SPARA program a couple of years ago. And yeah, it was so incredibly hot in New York, so incredibly hot. That's all I remember from it. But it was a great service, so really glad to be here. Thanks. Shall I go on to the next slide?
Yes, and so we are going to be heading straight into a breakout because it'd be really interesting to get to know when you think of trans issues in the UK, what sort of thing comes up in your head? Do you know anything already? Do you know nothing? And so for that, we're going to go straight into a breakout room of, let's say, like 4 minutes, where we hopefully, we don't want the spaces to be too big. So maybe if there's, how many people are here? About 25. So maybe like 4 breakout rooms would be great. And we will just let our magical technical support behind the scenes.
So I guess the objective in the breakout rooms, maybe there should be 2, so each of us can be in one.
Sure.
I know you don't want it to be big, but maybe we could just guide that conversation for a few minutes.
Okay, so that puts 12 to 13 people in each breakout.
Cool.
All right, and then I will make sure you and Eden are in one or the other. Okay, all right, I'm going to create them now. Let me just double check to make sure.
Oh, here we are, all the influx of people. I should reshare my screen. I need to keep remembering to do this. Eden, are you back?
Yes, I am. Sorry, I was remuted.
Right. Sorry, I think the breakout room was put on for something like 10 minutes, but I just wanted to get everyone back just to start the next section.
No, it's okay. Could you move to slide 3, which is the next one?
Yes, sorry, will do. There we are.
And so, yeah, so I just wanted to do a little bit of a glossary because I'm aware that not everybody here is necessarily trans. And so when we're talking about British transphobia in the public sphere, it's worth defining a few terms. In the context of this, I'm using the public sphere to describe a space where discussion about political topics is had in an open arena, especially in legislatures, the media, and by policymakers. So this is newspapers, TV channels, Parliament, or the House of Assembly or the Senate or whatever, and by think tanks. And so when we're talking about the public sphere, we're talking about that very, not necessarily very material layer. We're talking about our political elites. What do British political elites think about this issue? I'm defining transphobia as an active hostility towards trans people, and cissexism as a passive hostility or exclusion of trans people. I think both of these terms are good to use because not all policies that are put forward that sort of exclude trans people necessarily are generated by active hostility. It's about moving our thinking away from individual oppression to structural oppression. The term TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminism or Radical Feminist. And so this refers to a brand of radical feminism, which very much has a massive critique of the patriarchy and centers the patriarchy as the main form of societal oppression. TERFism is a version of that, which is trans exclusionary. My analysis of what is often called gender critical feminism is watered down TERFism, and I'll be going into that a little bit later in the workshop. There's the Gender Recognition Act, or GRA 2004, which is what allows trans people to apply for a new birth certificate in their new name. The GIDS, or Gender Identity Development Service, is the single national service used in England and Wales to support children and young people to medically transition. And then we have the Equality Act 2010, which is a piece of legislation that sort of grants equal rights to, or like aims to grant equal rights to people with a wide variety of protected characteristics in relation to goods, services, and employment. And I think it's worth starting with what the Equality Act does practically for a lot of trans people in the next section, which is, I would argue, despite recent worrying developments, the UK more broadly is still a better place to be trans than the US in terms of legal equality. And I think this is largely because federalism and the fact that the states have so much power in the US compared to our devolved nations in the UK mean that things can be very, very uneven. You can live in a progressive coded state such as New York or California and have some very, very good things. But as we're seeing at the moment with the banning of transition-related healthcare for children in the US, sort of if you live in Mississippi, if you live in Arkansas, if you live in what are often termed red states, you're often in a much more threatened position. And so even though the recent case of Bostock versus Clayton County in the US, which guaranteed employment rights to LGBT people in the US, we have had that in Great Britain since 2010. And so as much as I think things are bad in the UK, I don't want to over-egg it and suggest that we're in like a much worse situation than we are. A lot of the problems which I'm talking about exist within our policy sphere and exist within our media, but when it comes to the access to individual services, it can often be a little bit more mixed. Something that was talked about in my breakout room was transition-related healthcare. Transition-related healthcare is free in the UK. And it is generally not in the US because you don't have like a national health service. And what we'd probably see in the UK is that the long waiting lists are not because of a lack of funding, it's a political choice due to the fact that in the US you tend to have a form of access to transition-related healthcare called informed consent, where it's very really based on sort of, well, it's quite easy to access clinicians who don't necessarily want to define you as having gender dysphoria. They'll be happy to work on the basis of you want a particular form of healthcare and we will grant that to you. Whereas in the UK, unless you go private, we have a very gatekeeping process, and that's what makes the waiting times long, not the lack of funding. And just overall to restate, the centralization of power leads to an even more picture across the UK. All of our employment law is centralized to Westminster, with the exception of Northern Ireland, which has a whole bunch of asterisks next to it for a whole bunch of different reasons. So I want to emphasize that this is about our transphobia in our public sphere. And so next slide, please, John. What then is the problem in the UK?
Not the next one.
Yes, I'm going to show you what the problem is. And so this comes from a wide variety of different newspapers, both on the left and on the right. What is called in America the Times of London is our national newspaper of record. And we have from that newspaper calls to end transgender experiment on children, and J.K. Rowling fell foul of transgender thought police. In the Daily Telegraph, which is a right-wing newspaper, we had children who believe they are transgender could have autism, says controversial expert. In, I think, The Independent, which is a centrist or liberal newspaper, we have headlines about university turned down politically incorrect transgender research. In The Guardian, which is one of our liberal left newspapers, we have a op-ed entitled, "If we can't define what a woman is, how can we organize politically?" And then in The Morning Star, which is the UK's communist newspaper, a light has been shone on women's rights for all the world to see. A shocking tribunal decision against Maya Forstater, who lost her job for believing sex is immutable, has elevated the gender debate to a new field of international scrutiny. Maya Forstater was not renewed. Maya Forstater's contract was not renewed because she was deeply unpleasant and has tried to argue that her beliefs about trans people are a protected characteristic and failed. And this is the sort of reception that we can have to some of this in the UK. And a lot of this is through the power of reasonable concerns. Something which I think has happened in the UK, which hasn't yet happened in the US, is that transphobia is now common sense. It is something which is held across our political perspectives, and I'm going to go into a few examples of how that is now. It's the power of reasonable concerns. And so this fits into a couple of different areas. There's hostility to trans women specifically under often feminist reasoning. And so in the UK, there are some campaigns around de facto bathroom bills, but these are being run by feminists in the UK. And so there are feminists who argue that our Equality Act means it's legal to exclude trans women from any gendered public space, including toilets. Oppositions to our Gender Recognition Act reforms are usually based on, well, what if a man self-identifies as a woman? And it's framed as a very feminist concern. There's the scapegoating of trans prisoners, and there's the scapegoating of trans people in sport. And all of these campaigns in the UK are actually being run by people who describe themselves as feminists. And this is one of the reasons why they've gained so much influence and power. And this is one of the ways in which it's starting to transfer into the US, and we'll look at that. There's also the erasure of transmasculine people, especially in terms of hostility to trans-inclusive language and sexual and reproductive health services. Saying pregnant people is an erasure of womanhood, and pointing out that using trans-exclusive language or not using trans-inclusive language is described as the silencing of feminists. And then we are obviously seeing attacks on trans children and youth from a perspective which is framed as sort of concern trolling, essentially. And so it's, oh, well, like these young people being tricked into becoming trans, which is obviously very, very concerning. And so these are some of the consequences. We have seen our proposals for Gender Recognition Act reform dropped by our Conservative government. Freddie McConnell, who is a trans man who's a journalist, failed to be named as the father on his child's birth certificate. And recently, our court system has said that on our national census, when you put what your sex is, you have to put what is on your birth certificate, as opposed to what you live as, unless you have a gender recognition certificate, which applies to a very small number of trans people in the UK. And I guess that the disturbing thing, to be honest, is we've seen Trumpian politics on trans issues with a feminist sheen, and this is what is really, really concerning. The sorts of politics which progressive movements are really horrified about in the US, quite rightly, have entered the discourse in the UK in a really, really sort of, in seemingly a feminist way. And it is very, very weird to see some brands of very anti-trans feminists in the UK praise Trump and attack Joe Biden because of their different views on trans issues. We're seeing British feminists and US Republicans seeing eye to eye on a lot of these issues. And I would maybe argue that sort of the future of liberal transphobia in the US is going to take on a very similar pattern to what it has already done in the UK. And this is already starting to happen. And so we saw like Tulsi Gabbard, who is a former representative for Hawaii, try and sponsor a bill which would aim to exclude trans women from participating in women's sports. And this comes to like a point of reflection, I guess, for us. And so I think we're going to be going back into breakout rooms. And this is something I'm generally interested to ask you. Next slide, sorry.
And just on that, maybe we should do it kind of a few minutes now because we're behind time. Sure. This is when the breakout room should have ended, but maybe we can just throw it out generally to this group. There's not too many of us.
Sure.
If anyone has any comments.
Yeah, so some key questions. How many feminists in the US do you know who have taken a public stance on trans issues? Which stances have they taken? Which liberal publications and media outlets do you think take a positive line on trans rights? Who's disappointed you? Do you take for granted that progressive organizations will continue to support trans people, or do you think things are less certain? I don't live in the US. I'm just terminally on Twitter. And so it would be very interesting to see what you think of some of these. I've got an F in the chat.
F's all around. You can either type in the chat or we can come back to it later if no one has any kind of reflections.
Well, I think I can maybe provide something in terms of progressive organizations because I've had both good and bad experiences there. A lot of college students will intern in the US for their like local representative. And so I did that and I was very excited to do that because my local representative was the first gay man elected to the House of Reps. So like I was like, oh man, that's gonna be so cool. And then the office was extremely transphobic and I had to do a lot of education and get out of there kind of fast. So that's kind of like just, you know, a life lesson that not everyone who puts on a progressive front will be progressive when you get there. But then there is also, I think because of the way that the United States' nonprofit scene is built, there are a lot of nonprofits for the same issues. And so there are a lot of queer nonprofits. And those can generally be depended on to be trans friendly because a lot of them have done a very good job of making their boards super queer. And so there are trans people in the higher levels of power there, which keeps trans people at the lower levels safer.
Thank you. Really good reflection.
Definitely.
I know one thing, you know, I've seen a lot of charities that have really good policies around trans folks. The sector that is a bit different, and there's been recent articles about this, is the violence against women and girls sector, which is has a very, you know, their charities. And there's been some articles written recently about kind of the prevalence of transphobia within that charity sector. So yeah, I don't work for a charity in that sector, I work for a mental health charity, but yeah, interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think we're referring to the same article in Galdan.
Yes, Galdan.
And something that was found in that article was that the transphobia usually comes from middle and upper management rather than frontline workers. And the trade union, the United Voices of the World in the UK, is actually organising a VAGWA and gender-based violence worker trade union, which is doing some really cool work on these issues. We are already a little bit behind because it's May, awful. So let's move on to the next section. And I guess something that we want to communicate is that transphobia provides a definite through line for anti-Semitism. And this is one of the reasons why non-trans Jews really need to sort of pick up the ball and run with it in terms of doing something, because we're seeing some very, very disturbing sort of work around this. I think it's worth talking about how right-wing transphobic talking points have sort of become coded as left-wing through this sort of laundering process. And so most of like the most toxic like transphobia in not just the UK, but more broadly in Europe is sort of through right-wing ideology. And so we've seen a lot of attacks from the Catholic Church on trans people, like using the term gender ideology, which has very bizarrely moved into feminist spaces as this nefarious, nebulous thing that all trans people are a part of. And so we've seen the Catholic Church increasingly opposed to trans people. We have seen this really toxic combination of like anti-LGBT zones in Poland, coupled with opposition to abortion rights and historical revisionism around the Holocaust as part of a wider nationalist mission to reinforce the nation state. In the US, we have the National Review and the Federalist. But in Europe, at least, one of the things that we're very concerned about is like the right wing in Central Eastern Europe, where this has caused a lot of problems for the European Union in terms of promoting human rights. And it has caused like a lot of different issues around this. And we've seen sort of the laundering of right-wing homophobia and transphobia into progressive discourse, as I'll highlight on the next slide. I think we need to go just, could we go to slide before that? Oh.
This one?
Sorry, I think I've got a different order of slides on my presentation to you.
Which one? This one?
That slide was completed in my copy of the presentation.
Let me reshare that. Sorry.
Could you refresh it? I'm sorry.
I think I shared it before you'd worked on it. So let me just quickly go back into my drive. Do talk amongst yourselves.
That's okay. I can go into some of the points. And so we have a lot of complaining about sort of gay and bi men in particular from a lot of feminist figures in the UK. And so there's an increased backlash to the visibility of HIV-related care, especially in Scotland, which has been very concerning. There's been some campaigning against the presence of like LGBT clubs, or what in the US would maybe be called GSAs. And this has come from a spokesperson for the LGBT Alliance, which some people may have heard of, saying we can't have GSAs because what if there are predatory gay teachers? There's a lot of banning, like anti-banning conversion therapy from a lot of feminist campaigners because they want to use conversion therapy against trans people. We've had like the famous radical feminist Sheila Jeffreys in the UK Parliament refer to trans people as parasites. And there's been a massive moral panic around drag queen story hour, which is predominantly found among fascists, quite frankly. But in the UK, there's been trying to like ban children from seeing even like very safe for work aspects of gay culture. And this is very concerning because it's part of this trope as casting trans people as a powerful lobby group. The Association of Jewish Millionaires and Billionaires with the ascendancy of the movements for trans rights. We often hear the argument that George Soros is the reason why trans people are so powerful. There's also a Jewish millionaire called Martin Rothblatt, who is seen to be the reason why trans people exist, or like are more powerful. There's a new conspiracy theory of policy capture, where when trans-focused NGOs push essentially pro-trans things, it's framed as pushing out women in order to fulfill an anti-woman and an anti-sex-based analysis agenda. And we've even had sort of conspiracy theorizing saying that, oh, well, like this political party had a donation from Big Pharma and that's why they support trans people, because they want more trans children on their drugs. It truly is going into weird territory, and that's where we come to Jennifer Bielek, who some of you may have heard of already, which is on the next slide. Organising figure with a complexly developed conspiracy theory of a secret plan by Jewish billionaires to use transgenderism as a plot to bring about a transhumanist immortality project and enslave humanity through techno-capital. I love conspiracy theories. I just don't like them, well, I like harmless conspiracy theories. Also, associated with deep green resistance and across the aisle, we have a certain brand of transphobia in the UK and our Green Party, which is associated with the idea that trans people aren't natural and we want natural things. And most disturbingly, this has inspired some Oxford University funded research into the political erasure of sex, where prominent gender critical philosopher Jane Jones is essentially echoing a lot of the points that Jennifer Bielek has made, but in a slightly more sanitized way. She's still arguing that the trans rights agenda was invented in the 1990s, which is essentially the same difficult thing. And all of this is heavily cited and utilized in neo-Nazi thinking around trans people. And I guess the reason why this matters for Jews, and we're going to emphasize in the next one, it's important that we speak to non-trans Jewish allies to inform them of the dangerous tropes peddled by gender-critical feminists under the guise of sex-based rights, and how far many of the movement's leaders are involved in right-wing speeches, which ultimately uses the same fear-mongering and scapegoating tropes that target Jews. This quote is John's, and it's just absolutely perfect. I think it completely sort of encapsulates what this means. And now it's your section, I think, John.
Yeah, sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself. Thanks in the chat. Yes, Krista Peterson was a great source of information on the link between Bielek and Jane Jones. But I just want to, I think you know that Eden's touched on most of the things that we've said. Obviously, there's a big crossover between the ideas from the US, from Bielek, and then they're being subsumed into Dr. Jane Jones's thinking. And she's a very prominent UK-based gender critical person. But we've also got other figures who in the UK who allied themselves with the right wing. Posey Parker, you may have heard of her, one of the UK's most gender critical feminists, has appeared in what Mumsnet, which is kind of a hotbed of gender critical mums, are calling brave and interesting. It was a documentary with a video with a white nationalist in 2019. And I think, you know, it's important to realize this isn't just fringe people. You know, I've done a screenshot there of Janice Turner. She's a journalist who writes for The Times in 2017, published a piece in a national newspaper saying children sacrificed to appease the trans lobby. I wonder where we've heard this before. The trans lobby, you know, discourse again, trans people being seen as a mysterious, powerful elite, funded by high-profile figures such as Soros, and the late Magdalene Burns, often held up as a figurehead for many gender-critical people, tweeted this, you know, article featuring the hook-nosed character of George Soros with the rainbow. Other movements who like to use this kind of idea of a lobby, LGB Alliance, saying that we're a wealthy and totally out of control lobby. No to Fair Cop, the UK's free speech organization, who are notorious for media harassment, said that we're a children's blood cult. So we see this blood libel coming up again and again. And transition isn't seen as an exercise of personal and bodily autonomy, but it's seen as a destructive ideological mission that's set in motion by this sinister cabal, and we're trying to kind of brainwash the kids. There are also kind of other links to anti-Semitism and the trans movement, with some gender critical feminists in the UK actually comparing trans people, trans rights activists to Nazis. Obviously, this is even more twisted when we know the Nazis burned so many books around LGBT healthcare. Sarah Phillimore, a UK barrister, said that the word TERF will lead to gas chambers, and then compared trans people accessing facilities appropriate to their gender to a person self-identifying as Jewish and then threatening to burn down a synagogue. These tweets were also supported by a member of Scottish Parliament who supported Phillimore against the backlash at these tweets. Also, a Jewish journalist, Hadley Freeman, compared puberty blockers to Nazi experimentation. So we see this kind of victimization of gender critical women or gender critical individuals against this kind of powerful lobby who's just out there to harass and brainwash children. And it's really, it's not something that a lot of cisgender Jews take into consideration. And I think if they kind of sat down and saw kind of these insidious links between anti-Semitism and how people are talking about trans people, you know, it would be clear. But many people are taking a blind eye and not realizing the thinly veiled anti-Semitism for what it really is. Did you have anything to add on this? You're on mute.
There's always one, and that one is always me. I've got a slide sort of to round this topic off, which is next if you finished. And I think this has been mentioned by a couple of people in the chat so far, but I think for me, gender critical feminism as a watered down radical feminism is a white feminism, essentially. For white middle class cisgender heterosexual women, radical and socialist feminisms demand a lot of changes to one's personal life. They demand that like lesbian feminism, for example, demands that you leave your husbands and become lesbians, and they often require that you have like some really challenging conversations around sort of the domestic labor distribution in your household. And especially given how much of this comes from Mumsnet, which is a parenting blog in the UK with people with entirely too much time on their hands, I can't help but feel as though sort of intersectional feminist theory has decentered in some areas women who hold power on other axes, and gender critical feminism allows one to play feminist dress up without actually making your own personal political. It requires you changes in your own personal life, and gender critical feminism allows you to take one's anxiety about white womanhood and power and direct it against a scapegoat. It is very, very telling that lots of the fundraisers, especially the lawfare fundraisers, which aim to sue public institutions in submission, regularly raise more funding from the general public than centres that provide services to survivors of gender-based violence. Like, if you are feeling anxiety about your own complicity in power, it feels good to frame a marginalized group as powerful and kick it while it's down. And I think that's, for me, is where gender critical feminism comes from. And so I think this just depends on how much time we've got. John?
Yeah, I don't, because we've got about 13 minutes left. I still have to do the ending slide. So maybe we can leave comments for the end, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. And would this PowerPoint be available anywhere? Yes, it's on my Google Drive, and I will find a way to share that afterwards, if that's okay with Eden.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. So I wanted to round this off and kind of frame it with the Jewish community's response to trans inclusion. Perhaps this is the way that, you know, in our own communities, we're able to make a difference, even if it is only in our personal lives and the lives of our family, friends, and synagogue community. So I wanted to highlight some of the work that's been going on recently. We know that, you know, the Jewish community is a microcosm of the world at large. So I wanted just to, next slide. Okay, cool. So for people who are members of a Reform community, there's been various discussion events with trans Jews at various synagogues. In fact, my own journey to Judaism started at a Reform synagogue, West London, when I saw Rabbi Indigo, who is a freelance rabbi, speaking at the Bimmer, and I thought, you know, why would I go to another different denomination or synagogue? So that was the first place where I saw a trans rabbi, and there aren't any further trans rabbis in the UK, I don't think. And Eden, feel free to correct me. But in terms of people passing through Leobeck College, there's also, you know, that's the only progressive centre for ordination in the UK. We also haven't ordained an openly person of colour progressive rabbi for many years. Interestingly, the former senior rabbi of Reform Judaism, Laura Jana Klausner, has a non-binary child, and this has influenced many of her comments in the Jewish Chronicle, which is our mainstream Jewish press, around her support for the reform of the Gender Recognition Act and against kind of condemning, she's condemned the use of the transgender ideology language, which is good to see from a from ahead of a movement. And I worked last year with Eden and lots of other people on marking Trans Day of Remembrance in Edgware End of Reform Synagogue. And this was the first time trans Jews have led a Shabbat, a Transgender Day of Remembrance Shabbat service. And that was a really meaningful space to connect with each other, just meet each other, for some people for the first time, you know, and we were facing a lot of hostility around that time, around stuff like the Kira Bell cases and different things like that. So it was great that we were able to do this. We also got a bit of press in the Jewish News, which is another mainstream Jewish newspaper. So things, I guess, in terms of reform and liberal are quite good. In terms of liberal, that's my friend Surat, who's done a lot of work within liberal Judaism on projects that center LGBT liberal Jews. And I know the CEO of Liberal Judaism's made some really good statements. There was a hiccup last year where they invited a specific gender critical individual to speak at Pride. There had to be some conversations, especially with kind of some older rabbis who remembered working with them a long time ago, in terms of how times have changed and how, you know, it's not just enough to be up on lesbian and gay issues, you know. And I think there took some explaining around trans issues, but generally liberal Judaism is really good. I am now a Masorti Jew. I converted in a reform space and a member of a Masorti synagogue. I was really blessed to have a special aliyah in the flagship Masorti synagogue in the UK when I received my gender recognition certificate. And I think to date I've been the only trans person who has had an aliyah in a conservative synagogue in the UK to mark that. Recently they've started an entire LGBT network, so I've got some really high hopes. You know, even before my gender recognition certificate, when they did sex segregated services, they were very inclusive of this. Other things that have happened, that's me and my friend. We've been to Black Pride, which is an LGBT pride for people of color. I myself am mixed race. And it's just been great to celebrate that. Today, JW3 has put out a statement celebrating Trans Day of Visibility. We've had some interesting conversations with them recently about who they choose to platform, but it's good either way to see that they have taken that first step towards learning more about our community. I think I'll stop there because that leaves us around 7 minutes for kind of any questions or reflections on this session. I hope it's been useful for you to find out a bit more about what's going on. And I'm happy to share the slides. Any reflections, any experiences that you've had, if you've had to kind of tackle gender critical beliefs in your community?
I mean, I'll come in with a positive experience of the my Reform synagogue in Leeds, Sinai Synagogue, has been like so accepting and great, like even asking me about how to like incorporate gender neutral toilets and like how to make things more accepting, and like yeah, it's been very positive actually, so it's not all bad, I guess.
Thanks. Sorry, Sarat, I was just reading your comment. I didn't know you were here. Let's pick up about that offline. Really interested to hear more about that. I've since left the Reform for Masorti, but yeah, obviously there are going to be different rabbis who have different beliefs. I'm sorry to hear that you had a difficult experience. Happy to chat. And thanks, Lee. I think, yeah, it's great to recognize the positive things. Often when everything seems bad in the world, you know, synagogue spaces and faith spaces can seem like a sanctuary. So it's really important to have that. We've got a question in the chat. in terms of how would you recommend we Americans be proactive against this sort of trend in the US? And I'm guessing the trend, yeah, is kind of the rise of gender critical kind of beliefs being mainstream. Eden, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's not necessarily proactive, but the ACLU is doing some absolutely amazing lobbying and strategic litigation around this work. And I think that sort of, like, we're starting to get a similar product to the ACLU set up in the UK, but it doesn't have like as long a reputation. And so I definitely recommend following what the ACLU are doing, a lot of trans issues. A lot of the stuff in the moment in the US is around trans kids, especially in relation to sport and healthcare. I guess it's about taking the movements of which you're really already a part and sort of getting them to stand in allyship in whatever community you're in, whether it's a community group, whether it's an NGO, whether it's anything. You will have like trans people in those spaces who need your support. And so sort of it's about taking the spaces which you already can influence and making them like much more powerful for trans people.
I also think one of the issues in the UK is that the level of joined up support networks isn't great. And I think trans folks are so tired and so run down and burnt out from activism and from just combating these everyday microaggressions and aggressions that we face constantly, that it's difficult to make any progress when you're fighting fire. And I'm really getting that sense that a lot of people are, you know, struggling mentally as well as, you know, physically, even though a lot of things are online. So I would just really like for there to be more chances for trans folks to breathe and get some time out, get some time away from Twitter and bond together and really create a strong network in the UK. So those are just my talking to myself thoughts. Thank you for all your comments. I haven't had a chance to read through all of them. And thanks for the flag about around the time. We're ending in about 3 minutes. So if you want to have a look at your next session, please do have a look in your program. Yeah, that's great, Jake, that your mum's friend had a good experience with them being in the women's section. And I haven't mentioned Orthodoxy because I'm not Orthodox. I have prayed in Orthodox Minyanim when I've been to events like Limud, and obviously I pass quite well, so I haven't had any negative experiences. Obviously it's going to be different community to community. But thank you for all of your comments and for enjoying the presentation.
Likewise, thank you so much for spending this time with us and learning about a topic which can be very helpful. And I guess my hope for you is that you find stuff which is healing as well as revealing the more nasty side of anti-trans politics.
Thank you so much, Ellis. Thank you so much, Eden. This was incredibly helpful, thoughtful, and wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for attending. See you in the next room.
Thanks. Rabbi, before you go, I think your mic is a bit quiet. So if you're doing any presenting, you might want to.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's better. Yeah, just wanted to make you aware. Maybe Babette or you might be able to let us know what the best way to share the presentation is, if there is going to be kind of something sent out to everyone who attended.
My biggest suggestion, right, would be to try and probably send your presentation to Jessie at CBST.
Yeah.
So then he might be able to disseminate that to everybody, or at least would have that to if and put it in a library if that's what they're planning on doing. I will also be saving this chat and sending it to Jesse as well, so that if people need any of those emails and things like that, he will be able to work on that for you as well.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for your help as well with the session.
No
And
worries.
should we should probably go now if this room is being used.
Yes, unfortunately, everybody, I need to close the room for the next session. Have a really great day.
Great. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day. Have a good morning. Bye.